Good morning, Jeff, and welcome to the Low Carb Paleo Show.
Hey, good morning, Alan. My pleasure to be here.
Good morning, Mark. How is everyone doing?
Fine, thank you. Can't complain at all. Well, no one listens anyway, so let's just have fun today, shall we?
Right. We'll try that. So, Jeff, you and I met at the 2018 Paleo FX event in Austin, and I was somewhat aware of the healing abilities of mushrooms, but I never came across a product like yours in powder form. So we invited you, and here you are. Just a brief presentation. You are the president of Nammex, cultivating a line of medicinal mushrooms, and we'll talk some more about it a little later. First of all, can you tell us your background and how you came to this kind of business?
Well, yeah, actually, I was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, in Washington, actually, and we are an evergreen area. We get lots of rain, we have lots of forests, and those forests are full of mushrooms. In fact, mushrooms are everywhere in Washington State. So I grew up in that environment, and along the way, I was able to go out mushroom hunting with some of the adults, friends' parents. And my parents weren't mushroom hunters or anything like that, but I really enjoyed being outdoors. I got into mushroom hunting, and then when I went off to university, my field of study was anthropology, but at the same time, I still had this interest in mushrooms. So I also took some mycology courses. And in my anthropological studies, I actually dove very deeply into the use of mushrooms worldwide, not only for food, but also in shamanic practices for healing, and found that mushrooms were very instrumental in the human development. So after university, of course, there are not many jobs in anthropology, and I ended up in 1973 going to work on a commercial mushroom farm. And I stayed on that farm for the next 10 years.
And how did you make that your profession? You know, growing your own mushroom and starting your own company.
Well, actually, I spent 10 years there, and that was almost like an apprenticeship, Alan. It was a very big farm. It had 200 people working there, and we grew 2 million pounds of mushrooms a year on that farm. And growing mushrooms are really interesting. And I don't know whether you've ever seen the mushroom growing operations in France, but that's where mushroom growing of this particular species, which is the button mushroom that we find in the supermarkets, that's where it all began. It's called the champignon de Paris. And so on this particular farm, in order to grow all those mushrooms, every week we were putting in 4 new crops of mushrooms and throwing out 4 crops. We were on a 90-day cycle. And with the number of houses that we were growing these in, and a mushroom growing house these days is like a big warehouse, and they put in shelves or trays or something like this. And so over the course of my career, I mean, every year, because we were on this cropping cycle, I was seeing basically 200 crops of mushrooms every year for 10 years. So I basically saw 2,000 individual crops of mushrooms. And when you compare that to what a farmer might see in a lifetime, maybe 50 crops that he's planting in a lifetime, I was seeing 2,000 crops in that 10-year time period. And I loved it. I loved every minute of it. I was just so enchanted by it all. And I literally lived with mushrooms. I watched them grow from the very beginning, where just started out when we planted the mushroom seed, which we call spawn, and watched it grow out. Then I watched the mushrooms form, and I watched 4 different flushes that were harvested off of each crop. It was It was really something that resonated very deeply with me, and I enjoyed every minute of it. And so that was really where I got my start. And so in a sense, I'm a commercial mushroom grower by profession.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So in other words, you're a mushroom geek.
I am indeed, yeah, yeah, and there.
So without being too complicated, can you explain how one grows mushroom in a controlled environment?
Sure, sure. The thing about mushrooms is they don't have seeds. Mushrooms produce spores,
Mm-hmm.
and let me just go through the life cycle of that. So let's just say there's a spore out there in nature, and that spore will germinate into a very fine thread, like that we would call a hyphae, and multiple spores will germinate. Those hyphae that they germinate into will come together and will form a network. And that network is called mycelium. And that's normally what we don't see because in nature, it's out there in the ground, or it might be in a piece of wood. So we don't really see the mycelium, but that's the actual organism. That's the body of this. And when conditions are right, that mycelial body will put up a mushroom, which is what we would call a fruiting body. So you have spore, you have mycelium, you have mushroom. These are three what we might call plant parts of this particular organism. So just like any plant out there, you might have a root system, stalk, leaves, the fruit, the flowers, all of which we would call a plant part in the supplement industry, in terms of herbs and things like that. So with a mushroom, you've got these three plant parts. Now, when I go to grow mushrooms, I don't plant the spores. No, what we do is that we have got that mycelium that we maintain in a culture bank, and we will grow that mycelium out on a carrier material. And that could be grain, it could be wood, sawdust, something like that. We'll grow it out, and then we will take that myceliated grain or that fully grown mycelium on sawdust, and we will break it up and we will spread it into whatever it is that we're going to grow the mushroom in. Because the actual medium, for example, with the Agaricus mushroom, is a compost. A lot of other mushrooms grow on wood. So that's where we'd use the sawdust with the mycelium on it. But that's the actual, what we call spawn, or the seed to grow mushrooms. That mycelium then will grow out through the complete compost or the piece of wood. And once it's mature in that piece of wood or in the compost, then we will change the conditions to what would happen in nature, which is normally temperature drops, rains come, very much like the fall conditions here in the Northwest, and that will trigger the formation of the mushrooms. So essentially, we are taking a piece of live mycelium, growing it out, using that as our seed, and that colonizes whatever we're growing it in, and then ultimately we'll get mushrooms to form, which then, in terms of growing mushrooms, we will normally get flushes every maybe 10 days, for example, with Agaricus. 4 flushes, it's utilized all of its nutrients at that point, and then that crop is over. In the case of this farm that I worked on, every single crop grew 20,000 pounds of fresh mushrooms.
I see. Well, I'm not a mushroom expert by all means, and I've only maybe once or twice in my life gone mushroom hunting with my family, mostly my uncle. But one thing that always surprised me was that, at least in France, and I suppose same other places, but mushroom pop out only after it rains. Why is that?
Well, you got to remember that a mushroom is a fungal organism. Fungal organisms need moisture to thrive. So that's why they are usually embedded in something. That's why they're under the ground. That's why they're in wood. And again, that part of this organism is that mycelium. It has to be in a moist environment for it to survive and grow. If it dries out, whatever it's growing in, the mycelium itself will dry out and ultimately die. So that's where it's really, and what happens is think about it this way, is that mycelium during the summer, it's warm and it's out there in the ground and it's spreading, and it moves out and it consumes nutrients. It builds up a storage of nutrients. And then when the temperature changes in the fall and rains come, which in a sense give it a lot more energy, in the sense of it needs more moisture to produce this mushroom. Remember, a mushroom is 90% water, like most vegetables. Just like we would water our vegetables in a garden or something, well, mushrooms need that water too. So what happens is in the fall, the temperature falls, the rains come, and that triggers this mycelium into putting up that mushroom. A good mushroom season will have a very good amount of rain early on in the fall. That will trigger everything and get the whole cycle going. So that's really the reason why we'll see mushrooms in the fall, and why the rains are so important for that. Without those rains, a poor mushroom season would be a season where it's dry, we don't have a lot of rains, and people would be crying their eyes out that there's no mushrooms coming up out there in the woods where they normally go out hunting them.
Speaking of mushroom, there's another type of mushroom that French love to eat, is truffles. Can you explain how truffle exists? And it is a sort of mushroom, isn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, truffles are really, really interesting. It's what we would call a sclerotia, and these sclerotia are basically they grow underground, and they are a hardened mass of this mycelium. And so we have a number of fungi that will produce the truffle instead of actually producing a mushroom, which is the above ground, what we're used to seeing and what we are used to considering as a mushroom. The truffle actually grows underground. It grows. The interesting part about it is this particular fungus, it forms a relationship with certain trees.
Yes.
And so it's around the roots of these trees. And then again, in the fall, in the season, these truffles will form. You know, Alan, I actually was in France in 1979. I was there for a mushroom conference. We were able to go out into the area down in Perigord where the truffles, one of the famous areas for truffles. Yes. And we actually were able to go out into where they were actually growing in that area and have a local person find them for us. And you know what's so interesting about it is that traditionally what they use to find the truffle is a pig. And this person actually had the pig on a leash.
Right.
And so the pig was going along, and then when it smelled the truffle underground, it would want to kind of root it out. And so then the handler would kind of rein it in a little bit, and the handler had a stick that then it would dig out the truffle and harvest it, put it in the basket, and carry on. It was quite a sight to see this very, very large pig walking through these forests looking for the truffles. Now what they did later on, they discovered that this truffle hunting could be done much easier with a dog. So now they train dogs to do that. And actually, at the same time, we saw a very small poodle that was out doing the same job. But it's fascinating, really fascinating. And the truffle is an amazing, very expensive, but and when you eat it, which I found very interesting, was that it's not like you chop it up and you you throw it into a pan like I would with normal mushrooms that I find. No, no, no. It will go with either foie gras, a liver pate, and right in the very middle of that pate will be a diamond of truffle in there. And you just take a little tiny bit with every fork of the pate, or sometimes what they might do is just grate a little bit into something. But
shavings on top of
exactly used very sparingly, but it was fascinating, and it was wonderful to be over there in France in this area and see the culture, and that's a real big part of the food culture over there.
Right. I know your specialty is healing mushrooms, but do you know if I'm just asking out of curiosity, do you know if truffles have any kind of healing abilities as well?
Well, you know what, that's interesting. I haven't really seen any research that would indicate that, but what I would say is that all mushrooms have these compounds in their cell walls called beta-glucans that make every mushroom medicinal to some degree. The interesting part about the beta-glucan is that it varies from species to species, and that's why certain mushrooms are more medicinal than others. But basically, I consider all mushrooms medicinal. In fact, I look at mushrooms as one of those what I would call food as medicine. I think all mushrooms are in that category, and I think that putting mushrooms, in fact, I tell people, before you even think about supplementing, put mushrooms into your diet because they're a great food. They have these beta-glucans, which is the medicinal part of them. So you can get these medicinal compounds as well as eating a really high quality food with a mushroom. So that's the first thing I would always tell people is put mushrooms into your diet.
Right. So moving into what you do now, since we've talked enough about truffles now, you grow, and these are the most well-known, but there's more, and we'll talk some more about it later. You grow shiitake, oyster, and enoki mushrooms, and they are all certified organic. What can you tell us about these mushrooms in particular? What makes them so special?
Well, I think what you're referring to is the fact that when I was actually growing mushrooms at this farm back in the 70s, we had a Japanese scientist there, and he was actually growing shiitake, enoki taki, and oyster mushroom there. And the wonderful thing for me about that is there I am on an Agaricus farm learning how to grow mushrooms, being totally engaged in it. And here it is, he's growing these other species. And so for me, that was a wonderful opening to other mushrooms and the realization that okay, I can apply my skills to growing those mushrooms as well. And you know what, we actually grow about 12 different mushroom species. And what's interesting is that I have a book that's called Icons of Medicinal Mushrooms. It comes from China. It lists 272 medicinal mushrooms.
Wow.
And now all that really means is somebody along the way has done at least one scientific research paper about that particular mushroom. And in some cases, only one for some of those mushrooms. So they list it in the book. But really, in terms of the premier medicinal mushrooms, there's a tremendous body of research out there. And so we only sell about 10 or 12 species because a lot of them have very similar activities. So I just look at it as what was used traditionally. And then where do those traditionally used mushrooms have a body of scientific evidence behind them that demonstrates they do in fact have medicinal qualities. And so those are the ones that we've actually selected for our product line and what we sell out there. And Alain, I left the mushroom farm in 1983, and then in 1989 I started up my business growing mushrooms for medicinal purposes. And you know, part of the while I was at the mushroom farm for 10 years and in the interim period before I started my business, I read so much. I mean, I was just immersed in the mushroom literature, and I discovered that mushrooms had medicinal qualities to them. And so, you know, when you're a mushroom grower or you're growing any fresh produce, well, you know that as a grower, you have to get that fresh product to market immediately, or you have to put it in a cooler and then it goes out, but it's fresh. It needs to be there. So I realized in the 80s that that wasn't what I wanted to do in terms of a business, because you end up being, you know, and certainly in terms of mushrooms, I mean, mushrooms don't have a season. They have a season in the wild, but when you're growing mushrooms, they're growing 365 days a year. You are a babysitter to these mushroom crops. You have to get them harvested when they're ready. You have to get them in the cooler. You have to get them to market. It's a very demanding business. Whereas with our medicinal mushroom products, they are all dry powders. That means I can produce them and then I can put them on the shelf until somebody's ready to buy them. They have a shelf life, but a very long shelf life. So that's a much easier business in the sense of I'm not dealing with fresh products. So in that sense, you know, my business started in 1989, and you know, here's the funny thing. You know, there I am at Paleo FX where I met you, and it's really interesting because I just kind of got onto paleo, and I think it's a kind of a wonderful concept and way to eat. But back in the early days, in like 1990, I was going to Natural Foods Expo, like in Los Angeles. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it is one of the premier natural foods trade shows. And this is where all the supplement companies were. And I was walking around the floor there with a reishi mushroom in my hand. Right. And you've probably seen a reishi mushroom in it, and it's a beautiful mushroom, but it's woody. It's like a piece of wood. Yeah. And no company in 1990 had a mushroom product in their line of herbal supplements. Nobody. And so I'm walking around trying to introduce this to people, trying to say, look, are you familiar with medicinal mushrooms? And everybody's like, no. Well, let me tell you about them. Okay. But they just tell me, well, we have no demand for them. Why should we put out a product with these? So introducing medicinal mushrooms was something that I had to do right at the beginning with my company, starting in 1989, 1990, when I first formed Nammex.
Mm-hmm. So going back to medicinal mushroom, now some of the other mushrooms that you grow as well and produce is reishi, turkey's tail, turkey tail, lion's mane, cordyceps, and chaga. Now I assume, I mean, you know, from the packaging, I assume that each one has a particular benefit. Can you kind of, without going too deep, can you describe first the general benefits of turkey mushroom as medicine, and secondly, why each one is slightly different than the other one and how it helps us?
Sure. You know, like I was saying before, every mushroom has these beta glucans, and the beta glucans make up 50% of the cell walls in these mushrooms. And scientifically, what they've discovered, and a lot of the way that they've used mushrooms traditionally, has been as a method of enhancing our immunity. And these beta glucans, the science tells us that what happens is that these beta glucans, and again, I think one of the things that is important for people to know is that in general, I don't consider mushrooms to be super specific. I consider their action to be a little more non-specific, just like when I talk about the fact that they are going to enhance our immunity. What happens is that we consume the mushrooms or the mushroom supplements, they will come down and these beta glucans will react with certain sites we have in our intestines, and they will hit these receptor sites there, and that will stimulate the production of immune cells, whether it be macrophages or natural killer cells. They will basically stimulate the production of these. But the mushrooms themselves and these beta glucans and their activity will kind of sit in the background. They're there, and the way they describe that is they say modulation. So they are going to help to modulate our immune system, and in a sense, if we need them, then these immune cells will be there to sort of help us to fight off any sort of let's just say we're tired, or we feel like we're run down, or we're fatigued. That's one of the major sort of non-specific activities of mushrooms. And the premier mushroom for this, I would say, is reishi mushroom. Reishi mushroom is also something that people take with regularity as they age, because, you know, as we age, generally our immune system tends to degrade a little bit. It's not quite as strong as when we're younger. So that's something that is used a lot in China as what would be called a longevity herb. So reishi is a primary longevity herb working with us immunologically. Other mushrooms that would be similar in activity would be turkey tail. Turkey tail is something that they've actually developed into drugs in China and Japan. It's got high immunological activity. And what's interesting for me is that one of the tests that we do for our products, and I consider this really important, is we test for the beta glucans. So we've been doing this for about 3 years now. Every single lot that we produce, we will test those for the beta glucans. And what we found over this period of time was that it was the two mushrooms that had the highest levels of beta glucans were reishi and turkey tail, which was really interesting for us. And other mushrooms and their activities, we've got cordyceps, which has been used traditionally for what's considered neurasthenia. People who have a long-term illness, they're getting better, but they're still weak. They're fatigued. They prescribe cordyceps. Cordyceps is really interesting. It's called caterpillar fungus. So traditionally, what they used was this, and these caterpillar fungi, they are harvested in the foothills of Tibet. They're harvested up at like 10, 12,000 feet. And what happens is this caterpillar hibernates over winter. And while it's hibernating, it doesn't know this, but spores of this fungus have infected it. And while it's hibernating, they are growing. And they are invading this caterpillar. And by the time it's supposed to wake up, it's nothing but a shell.
Right.
And at that point in the summer, this shell of a former caterpillar will produce this small little blade-like fungus. It doesn't look like a mushroom at all. And what they call this is winter worm summer grass. That's the Chinese name for it. And they're literally on their hands and knees combing the pastures for these little cordyceps. And again, it's like a blade of grass. So they may be out there, and maybe in a day they might only find a half a dozen of these things.
Right.
But that's traditionally what was used for cordyceps.
Right. So would you describe mushrooms as adaptogens, or am I using the wrong term for that?
Oh no, I think that's definitely a good term for them. I think they're I would call them one of the premier adaptogens. You know, and the other thing about mushrooms that I think is just so important is that they're a food. You know, mushrooms are a food. So basically, they are truly food as medicine. And you know, I think everything we eat, we should think about it in terms of nourishing us. And that's part of this concept to me is our food should not only provide nourishment, but it should be providing us compounds that keep us healthy.
Yes.
And in that sense, I mean, that is really, in a way, medicine, not drug type medicine, but medicine that nourishes us physically and ultimately, I mean, you're a chef, spiritually, in terms of just that wonderful feeling of eating good food.
Yes.
So yes, absolutely adaptogens, premier adaptogens, I'd say.
Well, it's nowadays a lot of people are throwing this word around, and I just wanted to make sure that mushroom is the original adaptogens. Speaking of food, you should be proud of me. Yesterday, I played with your products, and I created what might be a good new dish. Who knows? Melted some butter. I put some of your mushroom powder, mix it in, so the butter would capture the flavor. And then I would poach scallops at low temperature, not high temperature. So they release some juice. And then I made a sauce with that, with the scallop juice and the mushroom and the butter. Added a little, can't remember the name for it, but anyway. And it came out really nice. And not only it tasted good, but I knew it was also good for me.
Yeah. Well, now I need a snack.
Well, well, you know what, Alan, I'm gonna send you a special product of ours. Okay. And this product is a blend of 5 different mushrooms. And this blend was put together by a very close friend of mine who was a vegetarian. He loved the mushrooms, and I would be sending him kilos of different mushrooms so he could work with them. And he put together this blend. We call it 5 Mushrooms Transforming. And it's designed as a food product. It's not designed as a supplement, it's designed as a food product. And I love this blend, and a lot of people who've used it, they say the same thing. They really love the flavor. I put it on a lot of different things, and it just works so well. I think you'd find it very interesting. So I'm definitely going to send you a package of that. Probably 500 grams. I think we have it in half pound and pound sizes. So I'll send you some of that to work with. Right. I think you'd enjoy it.
That'd be great. Yeah, I've also once in a while I will sprinkle the mushroom powder on top of a salad, and with the dressing, and mix it up so the mushroom powder gets into the dressing. And
yeah.
Do you think that mushroom powder is enhanced with fat? Does it make it easier to absorb, or does it matter?
Well, you know what? I'm not sure I can answer that. First of all, I'm not, I cook mushrooms, but I don't think about that so much. I mean, when I cook my mushrooms, I'm usually cooking them in butter, sometimes with an oil of some sort. But when I'm cooking them alone, I just like a very hot pan, put the oil in. I like to, if they're cooked on low heat, what I find is that the liquid comes right out of them, and I like to keep the liquid in. So I'll kind of brown them on each side, and then at a high enough temperature that it keeps that moisture inside them. And I will normally cook them a little longer than maybe some people would. I like them to be kind of firm. I like the sort of the caramelization on them. And that's how I will eat them if I'm just eating them alone. And I eat mushrooms all the time. I mean, I eat mushrooms 2, 3, 4 times a week easily.
Right.
They're one of my, it's like, and I can get fresh shiitake. I don't know if you're, certainly to me, the shiitake mushroom is my absolute favorite. I think it's just got a wonderful, wonderful flavor. The odor is fabulous. Yes. In China, it's called shangu, which means fragrant mushroom. And you smell it. And when you're on a shiitake farm, Alan, you cannot believe that odor is in the air, and it's just like perfume.
Yeah.
It is just beautiful. And but that's my favorite mushroom. And if there's any one mushroom, I tell people, if there's any one mushroom that you should be using, I mean, use the shiitake mushroom. It's so flavorful.
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk about mushroom quality. Why do you think it's important to grow organic mushroom?
Well, you know what? And my company's been certified since 1992. I just believe in organic food in general, because I think, especially today, we are consuming so many different chemicals and in every way, and many of which we have no idea that we're actually consuming them. And so to me, the more we can get away from consuming these chemicals, the better off we're going to be. And ultimately, I think we're going to live longer that way. So for all the mushrooms we grow, they're all certified organic. They're all grown in a sustainable way. And let me be clear here too. You know, one of the things that I realized as a mushroom grower back in the 90s, and in 1989, when I started my company, I took my first trip to China. I realized that if I wanted to grow mushrooms and sell them as supplements, I could not do that in North America. And the reason is pretty simple, is that we can grow mushrooms in North America and sell them as a food, fresh, but like most vegetables, a mushroom is 90% water. So you dry those mushrooms out, and that 1 pound of mushrooms that maybe I was able to get $5 for, now I have to get $50 because it's dried out. And so $50 for that pound of mushrooms simply doesn't work in the supplement market. So no supplement that has been produced in North America, no mushroom supplement, is actually a mushroom, and that's what's really interesting. So what I did is I realized that, okay, I traveled extensively in China. I visited farms. I visited conferences that I went to, and I visited factories and research institutes, and I realized that I'm going to have to grow mushrooms in China, which we do. We grow all our mushrooms in China. We process them there. And here's what I did as well. I told you, 1992, my company was certified organic. In 1997, I took OCIA, the primary organic certifier in the United States. I took them to China, and I organized the very first organic mushroom certification course in China, 1997. Today, we're getting, there are tons and tons of mushrooms in China grown organically and not certified by, you know, dodgy Chinese certifiers or anything like that. They're certified by high quality German certifiers. And you know, in the supplement industry right now, we have very strict regulations on pesticides. We have to test every single lot for pesticides. So before our products even leave China, we test them for heavy metals, we test them for pesticides, we test them for microbes, and then when they arrive in the United States, we do the same thing. We test them again. I'm a firm believer in that. I buy organic food. I live in a small community out here on the West Coast. We have one supermarket here, not a big one, not at all a big one compared to what they're like today. And we have a tiny little natural food store. I buy all of my produce at the natural food store, all of it, because they bring in organic produce. So that's very important to me. And you know what? I'm also very lucky. I'm on the outer coast of Vancouver Island. My front yard is the Pacific Ocean. We have fresh seafood here. In my backyard, they're getting crab commercially. Not only that, we have salmon, wild salmon going by our community here. I have access to the most amazing seafood in the world right here in my little community. I eat salmon 3 or 4 times a week as well. I love salmon. I think salmon is probably the world's perfect food.
Yeah, yeah, with mushroom.
Yes,
So
indeed.
what makes the difference between, and I know it's not a trick question, but I know there's an answer behind this, is what's the difference between your product quality and the other mushroom products out there?
Well, you know what's happened, and I sort of told you about just sort of talked about the fact that you can't grow mushrooms in North America and sell them as supplements. What companies in the United States do is they will grow out the mycelium on grain, and that's what, as a mushroom grower, we'd call grain spawn. That's what we'd use as seed. But instead, they grow the mycelium out of the grain, which is a simple process, but it's done in a laboratory. It's all under sterile conditions. They grow it out of the grain, and then at the end of the grow out period, which might be 30 to 60 days, they will dry it, grind it to a powder, and then they will sell that as a so-called mushroom supplement. Now, one of the things that we did is 3 years ago, I published a study where I took 95 samples, 40 of which were these myceliated grain products. I bought them off the internet. I had dried mushrooms. I had some of our mushroom extracts. We tested them all for beta glucans. And what we found were that these myceliated grain products were mostly starch from all the residual grains in them and very low in beta glucan content. In fact, it was just the opposite of what a mushroom is supposed to be. A mushroom would have 25 to 60% beta glucan and less than 5% of these starches, whereas these products would be just the opposite. They would have 30 to 60% starch and maybe 5% beta glucan. And you know, it's pretty obvious when you see how these products are produced that they're mostly grain. But the worst part of it, Alan, was that the products have on their label, it says shiitake mushroom or maitake mushroom, and it has a picture of a mushroom. Mm. And so if you were to go into a store and look at those products and want to buy them, you'd just say, oh yeah, it's a great mushroom product. And you say, oh yeah, I've heard this person talk and I'm going to buy his brand or something like that. Not knowing that actually you weren't even getting mushroom at all, but you were actually just getting grain powder for the most part. And let me tell you, after being at Paleo FX, and we've done that show for 3 years, and I speak to people there that stop by our booth and they say, oh, I'm taking this great mushroom product. And I say, oh, that's great. And they say, I love mushrooms. I think it's a great mushroom product. I say, well, what's the brand? They tell me the brand. And then I have to tell them, you know what? You're not taking a mushroom product. What you're taking is actually myceliated grain, and it's mostly grain starch. Well, I'm telling this to paleo people, and especially there are people there that are very strict paleo people, and to tell them that they're actually getting grains, that's not anything that they really want to hear. And you know, what's interesting is that what those products actually are you familiar with a food product called tempeh?
Yes.
Okay, tempeh is
fermented
soybeans, exactly, fermented soybeans. Well, the process, what it actually is they cook the soybeans and then they grow mycelium on it.
Okay. So
when you get a package of tempeh and you open it up and it's kind of whitish, that's mycelium. Okay. And that's a specific fungus that they've grown over the soybeans, but they sell it as a food. And if you look at the product, you can see that it's still mostly soybean with this mycelium growing. That's actually what's being produced, dried, ground to a powder, and sold in the marketplace and called mushroom. And it is simply not mushroom. And I feel really bad because 80%, and I mean this, 80% of the products on the shelf out there are this particular tempeh, like myceliated grain.
Mm-hmm. I just had a crazy idea pop in my mind, but isn't it true that most cheese, when it's aged, and especially the blue cheese kinds, actually contain mycelium, or at least a form of
they absolutely do. Yeah, it's a fungus that's growing on them.
It's a fungus, yes.
Yeah, and here's the difference: is that certain fungi, which we would call a basidiomycete primarily, will produce a actual fruiting body, will produce a mushroom, and those are called perfect fungi. They're fungi that have this mycelial body. They produce a mushroom. There's a whole huge group of fungi out there that have mycelial stage, but they do not produce a mushroom. And those are the fungi that are used in things like producing different cheeses and things like that. So you'll never see a mushroom growing off that blue cheese. You'll see the it in there and all the colorful nature of it and things like that, but it's not going to produce a mushroom because it's an imperfect fungus, and nature's loaded with them. In fact,
but isn't penicillin derived from this kind of blue? Okay.
Well, yes, exactly. It was originally what we would call a green mold or a blue-green mold, and it was discovered by accident by Alexander Fleming. You know, this whole story of him sort of finding this exudate coming off this mold that was a contaminant in his petri plates, and then he followed the trail, and it ultimately discovered penicillin, and the actual genus of that is called Penicillium. So he named it penicillin, but that is an imperfect fungus, and that's where a lot of the work is done on finding interesting new compounds, is with these imperfect fungi.
Well, I'm going to tell you a little story that might gross out some Americans, but when I was a kid and I was growing up on my grandparents' farm, if we'd get a cut or a scrape, kids, running around, jumping, whatever, my grandmother would apply some of that blue from a Roquefort or from a blue cheese. She would apply that on the scrape, on the cut.
Wow.
And then wrap a gauze around it, and that would take care of things.
That is really interesting. I've never heard that before, but that is fascinating. Absolutely.
That's what they call folk medicine.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
The other thing that I found interesting is in the 1700s in England, they used to call mushrooms poor man's meat.
Yeah. It is.
Big meaty mushrooms, right? A big meaty mushroom.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, poor man's meat.
Yeah. And the good of it is that once you're done healing, you can lick your arm and.
Yeah, right. Or maybe you'd want your dog, your pet, to do that for you.
So back to your business. So you offer different kind of products, powders. Can you describe them to us and kind of give us a general idea what they're good for?
Sure. Well, again, primarily used to enhance immunity. Cordyceps, because of the use of cordyceps for fatigue. Now, cordyceps is used by a lot of companies that are putting out an athletic type product, because they have demonstrated that cordyceps does have this ability to help utilize oxygen a little better. And so it's used as that type of supplement. There's lion's mane, which is interesting. Lion's mane research has shown it actually promotes what's called nerve growth factor, which we have, and that nerve growth factor stimulates or helps to produce neurites, which are brain cells. So the interesting thing about the lion's mane is there's not a lot of clinical trials out there, Alan, because it's an herbal product, and nobody wants to spend the money on a clinical trial for an herbal product when everybody can use that research themselves. So, but in Japan, they did a clinical trial with 70 30 people, 2 groups, 30 people in each group. So there was a control group, and these were all older people, 70 and older, something like that. They gave them a battery of tests first, and then for 3 months, one group took lion's mane, and then after they were finished, they gave them the test again, and the people taking the lion's mane showed a higher cognitive ability in that same battery of tests. So that was kind of interesting. And the interesting part about that too was that after they stopped taking the lion's mane from this test, they tested everybody again 30 days later, and they found that this group that had done so well with the lion's mane now was back to the baseline. Oh. So,
and you know, for business, eh?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. You have to take this for the rest of your life.
That's right.
And you know, we can all benefit. You know, let's face it. As we get older, the memory kind of gets a little bit faulty. What was that I was thinking of again? What was the name of that? I got it right there. I just can't remember. Well, so lion's mane right now has just gone crazy. 5 years ago, we weren't selling hardly any lion's mane. Now everybody and his brother, we can hardly keep it in stock. It's just crazy. And yet that's part of what you're probably familiar with, the concept of a nootropic. Mm-hmm. And a nootropic is anything that enhances our performance. And this is a big kind of a word for all the younger generation. And they're looking for all of these health benefits. They're looking for some way to get that edge in a sense to perform at a higher level. And so anything that does that is they consider nootropic. Lion's mane is now considered one of the premier nootropics for mental sharpness, mental ability. Now, you know, whether it does or not, I mean, there's some studies that would demonstrate this. It was used in China traditionally for dementia. And so it seems like, yeah, there's definitely something there, and the scientific research seems to indicate that. So lion's mane is something that's used in that way. Lion's mane, cordyceps, chaga now has become very popular too. I don't know if you're familiar with chaga, but chaga is this gnarly, actually it's a canker that grows off the sides of birch trees. It was a traditional medicine in Russia, Eastern Europe, traditional medicine for stomach ailments, and also there was a folk treatment for cancer. That's something that's really popular out there. One of the things about chaga is if you go out on the internet and Google up chaga, it'd be like king of mushrooms. and it'll be like, there's nothing that this mushroom can't do. And for me, I don't really like that kind of talk. I don't sell my products that way. I don't like to hype things, but chaga, if you were to actually read all this stuff, you'd be like, oh my God, it's a miracle. It's a panacea. Panaceas, my God, you know, don't talk to me about panaceas, because everybody and his brother's got some new product, wants to sell it as a panacea that will do everything. And it's just what I call marketing speak and trying to sell something. But it does have some good research behind it for things like, you know, stomach problems. And I would recommend chaga to anybody that's having, you know, irritable bowel syndrome or Crohn's disease or anything like that. Try chaga. It might help you there. So there are different benefits from a number of these different mushrooms. They all share beta glucans, but some of them have other compounds like reishi, chaga, a few other woody polypore type mushrooms have what are called triterpenoids, which these triterpenoids also, in terms of reishi, will help your liver function. So it's very good for liver function. In China, they use it a lot for people with liver problems and liver diseases. They'll use reishi for that too. So some of the mushrooms, besides sharing these beta glucans in common, will also have some of these other compounds which give them certain other activities. And that's why I consider reishi to be the premier mushroom, because not only does it have the beta glucans in a high amount of them, but it also has these triterpenoids. And again, for overall liver function, for your blood purification, things like that. So again, if someone was going to supplement with one mushroom, yeah, I would supplement with reishi. I take reishi every morning. I put it into my coffee. I don't know if you've ever tasted reishi or whether and I think we had some out maybe to taste at Paleo FX, but it's very bitter, very bitter. But I drink my coffee black. I put reishi in my coffee in the morning. It just adds another sort of bitter note to the coffee. I think it tastes okay like that. But if you were to just take a small amount of reishi meth, you go, oh my God, that is so bitter. It's like, give me some water. but reishi is great. I think it's the premier mushroom. And I look at it as just a longevity herb for me. I just look at it as something that hopefully it's going to help me cope with all the stresses. Reishi has also been used for people with insomnia. A lot of people have sleep problems. I don't, but a lot of people do. And that might be something people would try for insomnia and sleep difficulties.
Mm-hmm. Good. So last question for me, where can we find all the information about your products?
Well, my company is Nammex, Nammex. Please come to our website, nammex.com. I have so much information there about mushrooms and mushroom products. And I've also got some really great slideshows there that talk about mushroom cultivation, talk about all sorts of aspects of mushrooms. So nammex.com, for those people that are looking for a retail supplement, we sell online at realmushrooms.com, realmushrooms.com, and that's where you can buy our products individually for personal use. Nammex is a supplier of raw materials to other companies, so a lot of companies use our raw materials, and so that's a wholesale business to business, but we have a lot of information there. So please come to the site just for the information alone. But if you're looking for a mushroom product for your own personal use, go to realmushrooms.com. If you're a practitioner, we do have programs for practitioners if they wish to resell the product. So that's where people can go to learn more about it.
Great. I have a little quote from General de Gaulle. You remember who he is?
Oh,
right?
Of course I do. Absolutely, yeah.
He said that people are like mushroom. You keep them in the dark and feed them whole shit, and they'll be happy.
You don't know how many times I've heard that. But you know what's interesting about that? Here's what's interesting is that the mushroom, the champignon de Paris, the Agaricus mushroom, the button mushroom, that mushroom needs no light. But mushrooms in general, the vast majority of them need light to actually grow properly.
Right.
So
originally, if I'm right, I believe the champignon Paris was found in coal mine tunnels because it was dark, and then the carts in the old days were drawn by horses, so there was horse shit everywhere, and all of a sudden they found this mushroom growing in the dark and growing on the horse shit. That's
well, that you know what, one of the things about, like, for example, in France where it all started was that a lot of the places where they grew these mushrooms were in limestone tunnels because they quarried limestone like crazy over in France. So they have all of these mines, and the beauty of that for mushroom growing was that the temperature in that mine is constant. And the temperature was just perfect. The temperature and the air is fairly humid as well. So it was perfect for mushroom growing. And so, they see these things growing in the pastures, and they're gathering it wild for who knows, thousands of years. And then somebody gets the bright idea. They go, hey, I can collect that manure. I can make a compost from it. And then I can grow these mushrooms. And hey, we've got all these caves that we're no longer using, these old mines. And so they started growing it in the mines. And in fact, if you ever, I know you're back in Paris or back in France occasionally, in the Loire Valley, there's a great and I don't remember exactly where, but there's a great museum there where you go in and you go right into one of these tunnels, and they have a great exhibition there on how they actually grew these mushrooms back there, because they grew them with this compost right on the floor of these caves. And you know, again, perfect temperature. They didn't need light, so that worked out really well. And in fact, even when I started my work at the mushroom farm, and everything is grown indoors in these big warehouse rooms, we all had miner lights on. So we would go around through every room, and I'd have a miner's light, and I had a battery pack on my belt, and I had this light. I didn't have a helmet on, but I had a light. The harvesters all had helmets and the light on the helmet, and that's how they actually were harvesting the mushrooms.
Yeah. All right, Mark, it's your turn.
Yeah. I mean, we've been talking about the products. I mean, so let's continue on that for a minute.
Sure.
So you say you're mainly B2B, but you do have a line of more retail type of, what would you call them, mushroom supplements?
Yep, mushroom supplements.
So what are they and what are they good for?
Well, again, what we actually do is we'll take the mushrooms, the fresh mushrooms, we'll dry them out, and then we will turn them into a powder, and then we will cook them one time in a very, very large pressure vessel. We'll cook them in hot water. And you know, one of the things about mushrooms that we didn't talk about is mushrooms actually have a compound called chitin in their cell walls that is part of that cell wall with the beta glucan, and that chitin makes mushrooms a little bit more indigestible than most foods. When we cook these mushrooms in that hot water, and we do it at 80 degrees C, that will help to pre-digest that. And so what happens then is, after 3 hours of cooking it, we will then concentrate the fluid down into almost a syrup. It will still have the powder in it. We'll send it to a spray dryer, and out of the bottom of that will be a very fine powder. That's what we call a 1-to-1 extract. That's primarily what we sell. And then if we also have some extracts that are more concentrated, where instead of just what we have, let's say 1 kilo in, 1 kilo out, which we call our 1-to-1 extracts, we will maybe put 4 kilos in there, or 8 kilos or 16 kilos, which ultimately become a much more concentrated product. And that's, you know, a lot of companies, they don't want to put, let's say, a gram of something into their product. Maybe that's too much. So if you do a concentrate, you can put a lot less of that powder into a product because it's much more concentrated. We do our best with our extracts, to have exactly the same profile as the mushroom itself. We don't try to build this up or build that up. As a concentrate, it will have, you know, those particular compounds in a concentrated form there, but we don't try to build them up. We try to keep a natural profile. And again, primarily, I would say use them as something, an adjunct to your daily regimen, your health regimen. They'll be working in the background. And again, if you want to take one, reishi is a great one. Cordyceps is, I like cordyceps too for overall just general activity, things like that. Reishi or cordyceps, primarily, again, maybe fatigue, you're feeling low energy, things like that. Give them a try. Don't expect them to work overnight. They do not work overnight. It's not like taking a, ibuprofen or an aspirin or something like that. That's not how they work. You need to be taking them for 2, 3, 4 weeks before there's really going to be any activity from them. So think about it that way. Think about them as something, again, that you're taking in a regular way and will work in the background for you.
So are there any particular conditions that you know that mushroom supplements will help for?
Well, I mean, you might want to try lion's mane if you feel like you're, need a little help memory wise, and see if that helps you at all. That's definitely something that people are taking them for. Or if you do want to boost, you think, okay, performance wise, as an athlete, I feel fatigued, or maybe you just feel fatigued generally, then I would take them for that. But, the other thing you might hear about mushrooms that comes up a lot is used in with cancer therapies. So there are a lot of people that will use them as an adjunct therapy to, let's say you're in chemo, or somebody's going to answer that, but it won't be me. But you know what? I don't like to talk about cancer. It just, FDA doesn't want me to talk about cancer. We don't, promote that in any way. The research talks about it, but I don't like to talk about it because I can't really, and I don't want to even promote it as such because, I don't know, it's not going to cure anybody's cancer, but it could be used in conjunction with some of these therapies. So that's certainly a lot of people will take them for that reason. Turkey tail is one that a lot of people take. Reishi would be good for that as well. So that's just another area that people could possibly use them.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned earlier that mushrooms are one of the slightly more difficult things for the body to digest. And I know I know because of what we do, there are a number of people who have what they would call sensitivity towards certain mushrooms. Is that a fairly common thing?
Well, you know what my experience is that there is a percentage of people out there that may have a sensitivity to any particular food product. Mm-hmm. And with mushrooms, it's no different. Some people will have a sensitivity. What I tell people, especially if they're eating mushrooms for the first time, don't eat a huge plate of mushrooms. That's a trap. Yeah. You really need to, like with any food, take a small amount when you first eat it, see whether your system likes it or not. Some people, it's just not going to agree with them. And it might be just an allergic reaction. One of the adults that I knew when I was younger, one of my friend's fathers, he was a dyed-in-the-wool mushroom hunter. He loved mushrooms. He loved hunting them. He was totally allergic to morels. And morels, Alain, morels are something that a lot of chefs use in their cooking and stuff. Yes. Morels a delicious mushroom. He was allergic to morels. he would find them and just give them away to people because he couldn't eat them. So that's something everybody needs to think about. And I would say that's the same if you're gonna eat a new mushroom or if you're gonna try a mushroom supplement. Be aware of that fact.
Yeah. To a certain extent, you I think answered maybe part of the allergic reaction that some people see, in as much as certain mushrooms will enhance our immune system. They'll go off, and as you say, they'll go into receptor sites and they'll produce macrophages and that sort of thing. Could it be that they're encouraging some sort of cleansing reaction?
Well, here's another interesting thing about mushrooms is that mushrooms are very high in fiber. Mm-hmm. So if you're actually eating mushrooms, you're feeding your microbiome very high quality fiber. So that's part of them being not super digestible. Mm-hmm. So they're coming down. They're mostly being digested in our lower intestinal tract. Right. And that's where they're hitting the receptor sites, and that's where they're feeding the microbiome. So in that sense, I think actually having eating mushrooms in the sense of providing another food that's high in fiber is really good. And a lot of that fiber is actually
prebiotic.
Well, yes, and insoluble beta glucan. So that's where, yes, mushrooms are absolutely a prebiotic, and that's why I always tell people to add mushrooms to their diet. And look, you know what? When I sit down sometimes and eat mushrooms, if I'm just like, okay, I really want to have a meal of mushrooms, or I usually, if I'm eating a steak or something, I always have mushrooms on it. And I weighed an Agaricus not long ago, a medium-sized button mushroom. I weighed that button mushroom, and it was 40 grams.
Right.
Well, I can eat 10 of those, chop them up, throw them in the pan, fry them up. I can eat 10 of those easily. That's a pound of fresh mushrooms. That is just not a problem whatsoever. So think about that when people are eating mushrooms. I mean, don't just eat one or two. I mean, fry up 5 or 6 or 7 of those button mushrooms or more with the shiitake.
Super. Well, that's all the questions that I had. Alain, back to you.
All right. So, ready for my famous closing?
Yes. Let's hear it.
It's becoming a joke, so we keep it going. So, do you have anything else to add? Any other additional? Are you talking to conference? Are you going to anything special that you want to talk about?
Well, you know what? I like to do podcasts with people. It's always enjoyable to talk. I mean, there's so many interesting people out there like yourself, Alain, and it's so great. We do a few trade shows every year. We do Paleo FX. We do. I go to American Herbalist Guild often and do a show. The Bulletproof Conference, we did that whenever they had it out there too, so people can come and see us at those conferences. I haven't really done a lot of speaking. I travel quite a bit, but in terms of traveling off to do one specific talk somewhere, at times that's just more than I want to do. I'm up here, you know, I'm so far away right now from anywhere. I mean, where I live in this small community is a community of 2,000 people. It's a very small community. I enjoy it. I live in an old growth forest here. It's beautifully green outside. It does rain too much. So I leave in the wintertime and go elsewhere. And because I prefer to live in some more of a summery type environment. But the summers up here are beautiful, so I'm always here during the summer. But you know, no, just what I say is just if people want to come to the website, please come to the website, check out the information there, and read about the differences. And just be careful out there when you're looking at a mushroom supplement. If the supplement says made in the USA, it's probably this myceliated grain, and so you're not really going to get the benefits that you're looking for.
Right,
I mean,
and also be careful.
Is there anything that people should watch out for, and particular brands that you would say avoid?
Oh, I can't really mention brands. That's why, you know, I just try to educate people to the fact that look, be aware of this. Some of the products will, if you turn it over to Supplements Facts, they might on the backside say mycelium, and if you look in the other ingredients, this is where another tell. Look in the other ingredients, and it will say myceliated brown rice or myceliated oats. You know right away that's what those products are. And here's the thing, Alain, if you were to ever have one of those products and open up a capsule and taste it, you'd be like, this does not taste like mushroom. This doesn't taste like shiitake. This doesn't taste like, it's not bitter like reishi. It tastes a little bit like flour. Well, that's because it is. And so people just need to be, you know, I really do my best to educate people about this. That's really what I'm doing more than anything else, is I'm just trying to educate the market to the fact that there's what we call real mushrooms, and then there are these facsimile products. And that's really important because people who are looking for mushroom products want a mushroom product. They don't want a facsimile.
Right. And for the mushroom hunters out there, be very careful what you pick and what you eat.
Absolutely right. We want to see you next year. In fact, the Mycological Society we have in Vancouver, after the mushroom season, they always have what they call the Survivor's Banquet. And everybody brings a mushroom dish.
And whoever survives at the end gives the speech, right? Okay, here we go, closing. Thank you again, Jeff, for being on the Low Carb Paleo Show. And as we say in Texas, à votre santé, y'all.
That's good. That's very good.